Hello, welcome back. Well, I think we finally made it. We've reached the final part of building this C43 JK chassis. So today we're going to look at how we can set it up for racing. If you remember way back in this series, when we first started flattening the chassis and we put the J-bars in, this chassis here had the pans ever so slightly below the centre section. And the way we worked that out was to put some paper under the rear of the chassis, like so. So I've got two thicknesses of paper here under the rear of the chassis. And I'm just hanging the guide over the edge of the block here. And then if I tap on the rear of the pans, I can just feel them rock. And again, at this stage, it's always worth checking that throughout the rest of your build, when you've soldered the motor in, when you've scrubbed it, when you've done lead wires, etc., when you've done the back axle bushes, that you haven't bent the chassis in any way, or the chassis hasn't settled back into a twist. So it's always worth checking at this stage, before you do your final setup, that it is actually still flat and sitting nicely. So I can tell that yes, this pan and this pan are equidistant above the track, and they're pivoting about this central lump in the chassis. So I know that I'm going to have to very slightly raise this J-bar to allow the pans to sit level with the bottom of the chassis. Now that I've removed one piece of paper, I've still got a piece under there, and the pans are actually flat on the block. So that's why I came to the conclusion that I do need to raise them ever so slightly, and probably by the thickness of this piece of paper. Now, using a set of digital calipers probably isn't going to give me much idea of how thick that paper is, but it's saying it's 0.05 millimeters, which is 2 thou. So something like a piece of sellotape, something like that, would be fine to raise the pans. So what I could do is I could put a little bit of sellotape on top of this little raised section on the chassis, and that would lift this centre bar high enough to raise the pans up, so they should be level with the bottom of the chassis, and then the pans would rock on that centre pivot. So I've removed the rear J-bar. I'm just going to use a little bit of acetone on a cloth just to make sure I've cleaned all the grease off of the chassis and there's no greasy fingerprints or marks there where I'm going to stick the sellotape. So I clean that off. See my arm reaching across to grab my pair of tweezers, clean the end of the pair of tweezers. I'm going to take my little bit of tape that I've cut and place that over that little ridge like that. Flatten it down. Make a nice job of that. Then I'm going to insert the J-bar. Remember to insert it the same way that it came out. Don't flip it over, don't put it in a different way, because you've set your chassis up so that J-bars match this way round. Now, I haven't measured my sellotape to see how thick it is. I've got a feeling it's slightly thinner than that bit of paper that I used, but we shall see when I put the paper underneath as to whether I need to raise it anymore. So let's put one piece of paper underneath. No, that's pretty perfect. There is a very similar amount of movement either side. It's just rocking about this centre point. So now I'm happy with that. So now the back is spaced correctly. Let's move on to the front. Now if I hold it like this and I press down on that front corner of the pan, you can see how the J-bar is moving down, and that would drop the inside of the pan below the chassis. The same applies the other side, in that the chassis moves down and just drops below the front T-bar on the chassis. So I need to raise this front J-bar up a little bit just to actually make sure that these two front inner pans don't drop down too far and drag the track. So I'm going to do the same at the front as I did at the back. I'm going to remove the front J-bar I'm going to clean up the area where I'm going to be sticking the little bit of tape. Then I place the tape, and I'm going to put it in the middle. Some people put the tape on the outside. I'm going to put it in the middle. Now the reason why I'm going to put it in the middle is because I want the center of the pans just to have that little bit of flexibility and rock rather than be solid, by supporting it towards the outriggers there. So I'm just going to flatten that down with my tweezers just to make sure that's stuck nicely to the chassis. Put my J-bar back in. Again, remembering to get it the right way round. And let's have a look at how that front now sits. So hopefully you can see this in the picture now, in the video. But with that little bit of tape in the middle, the J-bar is now able to just hinge about that center spot. You can see it just hinging a bit there, like that. And these parts of the pans, the inner parts of the pans, now do not hang down below the T-bar at the front. So that's about what I want it. I don't want too much tape in there because it would lift the inner parts of the pans up, and then the edges will be rocking and the whole front of the pans will rock from side to side. I don't want that to happen. I literally just want to lift it up enough to keep the whole of the front end totally flat. Depending on how your chassis sits and how you've got it set up at the back, I originally set mine up with it pivoting about the middle. Now that's very good if you want the car to be nice and easy to drive and you're going to have a set of grippy tyres or you've got a grippy track. It works really nicely. But if maybe you've got a really slippery track or bad tyres, etc., you might want to consider putting some spacers towards the outside of the J-bar to stop some of the rock on the pans. It does make it harder to drive. It's maybe not as nice, it's not as smooth to drive, but you might want to try that out. Now, instead of using tape or Lexan underneath the bar, I've just slid on some insulation. Now, it's insulation from wiring like this, from lead wire, so it just slides onto the J-bar. You've got to be careful that still that works out, that the height of your pans are still right and it's flat across the back. But yeah, if you can find some of the right thickness, then that can work quite well, because it is actually damped. If you think about it, because it's like that rubbery silicone rubber texture, then it will actually damp some of the twisting and movement. So I quite like that idea. One of the last bits of chassis tweaking is a use of this stuff. Well, this is like silicone gel tape. It's actually double-sided, but it's pretty sticky. And we're going to use this to damp some of this movement of the chassis. Again, it depends on personal preference and driving style. Some people quite like a chassis that moves around a lot because it does make it easier to drive. But if you can make that car a little bit tighter, perhaps, you know, it will work a little bit better. Maybe it has slightly more grip, but it does make it slightly harder to drive, and it might tend to chatter out of corners if there's a lot of grip, or it might tip, the front end might come out the slot. So again, it's personal preference and see what you like, but you can tune your car with tyres, with positions of the body shell, things like that. So it's all got to work together. So I'm going to cut some of this gel tape and put it in some key points on the chassis to help dampen the movement. So I've got my piece of gel tape that I've cut. Now, when you're actually sticking it to your chassis, you could decide where do you want the pans to sit when you put your gel tape on. Do you want more weight towards the rear? Do you want more weight towards the front? But ultimately, you need to make sure that it's more or less taped in the middle of the sideways motion of the pans. So I'm going to try and make sure that everything's sort of in the middle like that. Now, I tend to tape mine so that the pans are not all the way back or all the way forward, but they are just sort of about halfway in between so that they can move in all directions. So there we are. I've tried to equal my gaps at the front, equal the gaps at the back, and try and get it about halfway in terms of that forward and aft movement. So then I'm going to stick my gel tape in place. I'm just going to hold those two parts together and I'm going to stick it across there. I've already cleaned the chassis up. I happened to cut another piece, so that's going to go across there on the other side, like that. Now, although it seems quite sticky in your hands, its initial bite is really not that much. You have to leave it to stick for a little while, and then it actually, the adhesive activates and it does stick a lot more rigidly to your chassis. Notice it's got this backing on it. I'm going to leave that on until I've just finished with all the other parts, and then I'll peel that backing off. So it's probably not a secret where to put the tape. There's plenty of pictures online of cars with tape on, production cars like this with the tape on, but I quite like it there. But it does depend on the thickness of the gel tape, the width of it, etc. that you use. You can change the amount of damping that you have on your chassis. Some people just put it on the rear, some people just put it on the front, some have it both. But the thing to do is just to try it out. Your driving has to be consistent enough on the track you're on to be able to feel a difference. But if that's the case, then you definitely can feel a difference depending on where you put the gel tape. So I'm going to trim it off with a knife, trim out round the little parts like this to make it look a little bit neater, and then I'll take that protective coating off. Some people like to leave the protective coating on because it makes the gel tape even stiffer. And you can see now that the chassis is quite hard to move. It will be slightly easier to move once I've removed that protective coating on the other side. So protective coating removed. Sometimes it can be really hard to remove, but if you leave the gel tape to stick to the chassis for a few minutes before you try and remove that protective top coat, then you can just, with a little knife, you can just pick it out from under the edges and it should peel off nicely. So to turn this into a runner, all I need, other than my axle, which I had earlier, is some back tyres and a body shell. Well, if you haven't seen those two videos, I'll put a link on the screen now. You can see I talk about how to true your tyres up, how to finish the edges nicely to make your car handle, and also take you through how to build a body shell or how to trim it out and cut it up and pin it onto your car nicely. So have a look at those two videos and then you can hopefully have a race winning car. Thank you very much for watching again, and hope you really enjoyed this series of how to set up your C43 and how to build it in the first place. So thank you again for watching. If you haven't subscribed, please do so, and I look forward to seeing you in the next tech tip. Bye for now.